both for some fantastic presentations. I'm sure there are questions, comments, views. Jim?
Thank you. Thank you, Phyllis, for a really interesting set of papers, and especially at this late hour. And the fact that I feel energized is really a reflection on our work. So I wanted to pick up a bit from Faith, what you, I think, have so usefully introduced the concept of sexual respectability, particularly because I think in post-colonial context, I'm not sure terms like heteronormativity actually carry on very well. And so the thing that I was interested in both papers is the way in which transnational capital might be making this notion of sexual respectability in each of these contexts more flexible. And I was wondering about that, Sujata, for example, in your paper when you were talking about, you placed this within the context of sex tourism and not sort of medical tourism as in kidneys and, sort of purchase of kidneys and all of that. And at the same time, I remember from the film Made in India, which I watched a little while ago, but, the main, the protagonist, I forget her name. Asya, thank you. And Asya sort of, if I remember correctly, her husband's not in favor of this, and she persuades him. And so that's sort of that question about how the film and how this question of sexual respectability gets worked out as you have a woman who is at the same time sort of, part of her comportment, her veil is in fact a demonstration of her sexual respectability, who is then sort of, away for 7 months, all of that, right? The sort of the layers of the way in which sexual respectability is being negotiated or not. And similarly, Faith, I was wondering in terms of your juxtaposition of some of the writings at the turn of the 20th century, to what degree is that sort of pushing beyond this dichotomy that you were clearly troubling between the sort of the homophobic, the Caribbean is the most homophobic place, and in a way that is being claimed by the nationalists, versus the sex tourism, right? That sort of dichotomy. And I was wondering to what degree the sort of the narratives that you shared with us were again pushing the borders of that kind of sexual respectability, which seems very narrow from the angle of the present.
Okay, so thanks. Yeah, so I think that respectability is very important and often overlooked, because at some level what the post-colonial, especially non-white post-colonial subject is constantly doing is compensating for the non-whiteness, right? Which the legacy of that is understood to be a kind of stain and a kind of something that has to be justified. So you justify it by whatever it is, learning Shakespeare or becoming a doctor or in all kinds of registers. That's one way of thinking about the history of post-colonial subjectivity or the struggle for independence or whatever it is. And so to be caught in her bedroom in the 1910 incident we can think of it as kind of that's a scene that's kind of hovering over the nation to come. Both that it shows how you see how the elite both kind of resident white and whitish elite and also metropolitan resident elite. You see how they're against us. You see how they don't want us to live our lives, and so there's that sense that there's a kind of memory of the history of being kind of sexually exposed. There's a kind of salaciousness of black sexuality, but also that scene, that her bedroom is also a space that continues to stain you, right? So to stain the man. So on the one hand, it's the source of his, it's understood by everybody as a place to have a good time. So, whatever, sexual rejuvenation, whatever. But also the place that is always waiting to, part of what I'm interested in here and in the project as a whole is the way that the non-white woman bequeaths to her descendants this kind of bad citizenship, bad subjectivity, that to stand beside her or to be to be her descendant is to have to kind of always argue yourself out of what Christina Sharp would call being blackened by her, right? So I'm interested in how how her bedroom and her sex body is central to this, but then she kind of falls from view because she, at least in terms of this case, she isn't sharing in the social mobility that he's going to get. And I'm not romanticizing his social mobility. There are problems, blah, 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 blah. But there's a way in which she gets occluded, even as she remains as kind of central to the narrative. So that respectability narrative is always going to be attached to present-day discourses. It seems to me it kind of undergirds, even usually implicitly, the confidence that people have to say, homophobia? Come on, we're misunderstood, or they don't know the history, or whatever it is. It's kind of always lurking there as a way of representing the resistance to homophobia always as a foreign negative thing. I haven't really answered the way you put it, but somewhere in there.
Okay, I'll keep my response really brief. I don't think this practice actually changes the discourses of sexual respectability. And just to go back to Made in India, one of the things that's striking is the woman actually says she wore the burqa for privacy reasons, not because she is a practicing Muslim, but she does it only after she gets into the surrogacy industry, and she wears it as a show of some kind of autonomy, which again, the Made in India documentary undoes immediately. I think the husband, I'm not willing to take his protestations at face value. I think that's a particular way of showing up his own masculinity, because to have his wife participate in this industry shows him to be a poor breadwinner. Yeah. So he needs to do that, but as I was telling Banu earlier, one of the stipulations is that the husband has to assent to the process. He has to sign the document. So he is participating in that. But I think the reason why I say sexual respectability is not dismantled is because most of these women are brought into the industry by some other distant female, relative of some kind who tells them, participate in this. And they have to tell them, you're not having sex with anybody, so you still remain a chaste woman. You're still married to your husband, this is a scientific process, etc. So a lot of these women will not tell anybody where they're going. They'll actually make up stories that they're going to go work somewhere else. And so that's one of the reasons these rural women are being brought in. And they're being brought to cities where they are kept at a distance. So they create fictions when they go back. And just the one last point is, as part of the speaking surrogate phenomenon, more recently, a lot of the surrogacy centers have been sending in spokeswomen to news programs. And a lot of the women will both make two claims. One is they're doing it for the betterment of other children. They're not doing it for any kind of material gain for themselves. And in a more insidious way, they tap into particular kinds of mythologies to say this practice has always existed in India. This is there in the Mahabharata. But it's a different technology of surrogacy. Now we have a more scientific surrogacy practice, so we still good Indian women even as we practice it.
Sujata, I want to, it's so interesting. I want to push you a little on the idea that there is a potential for queering here in what's going on in this, because what's always interested me about sort of surrogacy in general, but particularly the phenomenon of transnational surrogacy, is that I think there is this potential because of the disarticulation of genes and bodies and maternity and paternity, that it's not all conflated into the sort of heterosexual nuclear norm in this way. But it is recapitulated into that through discourses of altruism, which are some of the dominant discourses in there, and we're doing this for other women, through sort of the reinscription of quite normative ideas of maternity, of what it means to be a woman. And so I guess to me it's less evidence of queering than it is more evidence of the capaciousness of gender normativity to find new homes in places that even appear to give you the opportunity to disrupt that. Because it does give you the opportunity, but yet it doesn't. Huh? But it doesn't, yeah. I mean, so, well, I mean, I guess I'm wondering why you would choose to use the word queering for that.
Well, I was actually hinting at the possibilities that it offers rather than what it actually does. And I absolutely agree. It sort of recenters the family. It recenters, especially now, very traditional definitions of the heterosexual family. So one of the striking things about, let's say, even when gay couples could hire a surrogate to do it, is interestingly, it's always only male couples who are shown. It's never lesbian couples shown as practicing surrogacy. You're right, it doesn't disrupt the family structure, but I think it does something about race in an international context, which I think alters traditional definitions of race, especially when you have, let's say, the birthing rituals, etc., that these women perform with the prospective parent. So, the surrogate having some kind of naming ceremony with, let's say, a Japanese surrogate or prospective parent disrupts in some ways notions of Indian purity or the Indian family as a whole. Do you get what I'm saying?
I do. I'm not sure I'm buying it. I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, I think it's disruptive visually, but it's disruptive visually, but if it's recapitulated, in her, I have done this. Now I go back home. I've given this gift to this, these beneficent foreign couple. I've given my altruistic body to do this, and then I go back. The disruption becomes this momentary visual disruption of, a sort of Benetton ad disruption, and doesn't necessarily become a disruption that is about undoing some of the hierarchies embedded in that, right?
Yeah, no, it's just very momentary. It's not. I'm going to put this away. It doesn't do the job of completely dismantling them. But I do think the fact that the women, actually most of these women come back. The surrogacy is never just a one-time deal. They come back multiple times, and it produces some kind of cosmopolitan subjectivity in these women. These women who are, in every sense of the word, subalterns, and probably don't belong to the nation, now suddenly become cosmopolitan through this practice. So it's a different kind of belonging and citizenship.
That's interesting. Is there a follow-up, I think?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to be negative Nancy over here. This is a follow-up to that conversation, but I'm not sure in terms of even the images, the images of surrogacy, what I saw when I saw those images was reminiscent of images of slave women breastfeeding one's babies, right? Which arguably disrupts racial purity category and yet existed under the most one of the most racialized systems to ever exist in the world, right? And so what the images looked like to me were like a neoliberal mammification of the third world woman, where now it's along economic lines. Well, not that it wasn't along economic lines then. It's along a different type of economic lines that women of color's bodies are being seen as productive in a way that helps the babies of first world people. And I think part of what I don't see as non-traditional is that their families get disrupted, right? So they're taken for 7 months away from their own children in a way that I think, again, is very reminiscent of like this historical destabilization of women of color's families through capitalism. So I don't know that I'm like feeling super like there's a lot of space for sort of counter-hegemonic possibilities within that.
I'll buy that. There isn't entirely, but I do want to say, just because of the different kinds, and it shifts how we think of the mammification processes so that it becomes more multiracial, let's say. And I do think there's something in the Indian taxonomies of race and racialization processes. I think there's something else going on there. It's easy to read this simply as brown women taking care of white people's children. I think there was some of those images suggestive of that, but I ended with the two women sitting down, each with a baby, to sort of suggest some visual equality that's being created, which is different from previous images of the mammy in the service of the first world woman. So it's again, I don't want to say that the surrogates are not being exploited, that this is a good system, but I do think because it's circulating in transnational space, there's something going on there that exceeds previous categories.
Can I suggest something quickly? I think the only thing that's disruptive is how much money the woman makes compared to the husband. Right. And that disrupts the heteronormative family and the kind of family dynamics of the kind of power she wields. And there's beginning to be some, I think, stories about the ways in which the family shifts. Now that she's made in 1 year what the family is likely to have made in a lifetime. So that is only potential.
Right. We have a question.
Hi, thank you. It's really hard to jump in here. I guess it's also a testament to how great the papers were, because it's really frustrating to be on the periphery and wait. But I just want to understand something sort of in between from these positions about racialization. Like, I think there is some kind of a change. I'm not sure it's clear in any positive sense, but I do like your point that there's some kind of change, although, I mean, I'm no expert on racial formation within India, and clearly you are, and Banu can speak to that, but I think there is some kind of shift in some way, at least in the perception in global North nations, but I think it may be tied to the positionality of India itself and being seen as, its position geopolitically being seen as sort of quite different, and this kind of site of, innovation and economically on the rise and so on, is a sort of desirability of certain kinds of Indian immigrants in the U.S. becomes associated with sort of, the knowledge economy and leading this and so on. And so I think there is some kind of shifting racial formation that goes on. But I think it's very complex and fine-grained, and I'm surprised that people were sort of reducing it to kind of black-white. Because I think you're right, it's brown, it's different. And the meanings are really quite different. Like, and really these meanings and racial formations as they're shifting are very fine-grained globally. And, really, for example, in the New York Times, piece that you showed the cover, which is so striking visually because she wants a white surrogate, and it's very striking because then there is also in the interior you have the slave image because she has a black nanny, and yet into the black nanny you don't want her body. You know, you want a less intimate relation there, and she is photographed very strikingly on sort of a beat up porch that almost really looks like as I recall, it really almost looks like 19th century. And there was a lot of objection to that. There was a lot of reaction because the racialization was so striking, which is not, I think sort of like there are these kind of very different kind of shifting things that are very complicated, like a Japanese couple with an Indian woman. I mean, this is quite complicated, and it's also like, because I also have a student who's working on changing circuits of global adoption, and it's sort of very similar in terms of U.S. parents, at least in the desirability of adopting from different nations. You see shifting racial formations and their meanings, but it's very fine-grained. I mean, when people are thinking about these things and where they want a surrogate, or I don't know, also I'm interested in these eggs. Where are the egg donors? Where do they want to purchase eggs? They want Japanese eggs or Swedish eggs, or are they bringing over U.S. eggs? Because I think it's all people are really thinking about these things in incredibly fine-grained ways now.
And just to sort of complete what you were saying, the egg donors, each of these websites has different places you can get eggs from, and depending on where you get your eggs from, you pay a different amount. So, like I said, it's 25,000, but if it's a Swedish blonde, it's a certain amount.
So it's very fine-grained.
Right. And just so you know, this entire phenomenon, India would position this as reproductive, this as medical tourism. And this is part of the India's shining moment. We are a technologically advanced state. It's all about it's about a medical prowess. And I think what they forget in some ways is that this is actually a service industry, and that gets written out entirely. And so that happens, and I think what is interesting is, given colonization and how Eurocentric India and Indians have tended to be, to actually be in the service of Africans or Afghanis or Saudi Arabians, that is deeply problematic within India. And so it complicates things a lot, and I think my main point is that mainstream media images are far more simplistic and binary. So we get different things by going to what the surrogates are presenting.
Rachel?
I can't help looking at these images. I can't help thinking about sex work and about the discourse about sex work. And on one hand, I mean, this is sort of being defined in opposition to that. It's sort of the anti-sex work, right? It's like you have to be totally medicalized, and you can't even see your husband for the whole time, and it's kind of these great pains are taken to make it clear, that the sexual respectability is there, that it's not sex work at all. And yet, there's these obvious kind of parallels, and there's this where these are just the two areas where women suddenly have this enormous earning power, and it kind of has the potential to disrupt gender relations and open up this entirely new possibilities for women. And I think I'm not deep into the kind of critiques of this, but my sense is that there's also that sort of tension between certain critique of this as inherently exploitative and a critique that sort of says, it's exploitative when people aren't being given their money or something, but it's not, it's not inherently so. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of reflect on the how this fits in with a kind of in a sex work framework.
It is very similar to sex work in terms of the political economy of the whole thing, but as even you pointed out, everybody in the industry, both the prospective parents and the surrogates and the surrogacy industry, will point out to you repeatedly that this is not the sex industry. This is more about giving people the gift of life, etc. And I think what is interesting to me, at least, and this may be pushing it, but I think Indian women's fertility and their capacity to reproduce has been so denigrated in the Western world. You know, this is the cause of overpopulation in the world. And now this is being recalibrated both in India and the West as the engine of economic growth. And so there's something happening, and of course this is not for the surrogates themselves, but it's also not like the sex work industry which gets hidden. This is actually being high profile. That this is, again, we have surplus capital in this area and we give you the gifts that you lack. So it's about Indian superiority, etc. It's not the same thing as something that we need to hide.
And that, I mean, the female consumer is also a really key part of that, right? Of the respectability, right? That's the thing. So giving a baby to a couple is
But I think it's interesting that it stands at it's at the nexus of so many other kinds of familiar narratives. So I was thinking about the continuum, not so much to sex work, but to kind of caregiving, and which is often transnational, and is related to this idea that you kind of, relative to the first quotation you showed, you kind of hand off to a woman at some other level in order that you might be a professional who can, you know, break the glass ceiling. So it's not the same as this, but it seems to me that it's also could be linked to that history as well. So
I wanted to go back to adoption because I feel like this probably can't be your project, right? But it seems like there would be something so instructive about doing a comparative project about what is the difference in transnational adoption and surrogacy, and how does racialization play out differently when there's this idea that there's, on the one hand, there's a form of consumerism and sort of designing your baby, right? And then the other, there's this idea of you know, sort of a reverse gift, like the unwanted children of the world. And so it just seems like there's something very rich in that comparative project of exactly what narratives are being mobilized, but also the political economy of that and the political procedures around what's legal and illegal and how all these things work. And I'm just curious if it came up as you were looking at social media, any comparative piece around how adoption is narrated in the same spaces of social media.
No. I think that surrogacy centers would not want to have adoption in the same page as surrogacy.
Yes, right.
But I also think those are framed quite differently by the people who are the parents. So for the people who participate in transnational surrogacy, it's about having a particular kind of genetic link. So there has to be one parent who provides some genetic element to this fetus. And so this is about, as I keep putting it, the natural right to bear children, and so they will exercise it in any way possible. And they do want to say that this is not. They have considered adoption, they will adopt later on, but they want to have their own baby first. And I think what is different about transnational adoption, though, is that is really about philanthropy, right? So I am doing good for the world. So it's not the reverse, that I'm, you know, it's not the surrogate giving you a gift, but I'm giving you a gift by taking the baby away from you. So I think it's a slightly different process of gift giving that is going on there. But I haven't, the prospective parents will bring up adoption and why they're not choosing it. And they're highly defensive about it, but it's not the same thing.
I am standing up because because I am ending this portion of it as much as we will continue. Thank you, first of all.